Anyway, so I guess we'll be talking about grid cells and knowledge and image spaces. I guess first, specifically, one paper of yours from the kind of visual side, visual impairment side, and then a bit more broadly. Before we do that, I was just curious, what exactly is a PhD in anthropology and epistemology of complexity?
Yeah, when I finished university, I actually studied clinical psychology at university. And then I started working for a while. But then I always wanted to be a philosopher since the beginning. But then when I wanted to do philosophy at the university, like my family, my parents were not very happy with that. Is that what kind of job you're going to do afterwards? And then I thought that psychology was a good solution, possible solution.
That's also why the clinical focus, because it has a more obvious job.
Exactly. But then afterwards, I was looking for a PhD, and I found this PhD that's on the paper was highly interdisciplinary. And I think it really met with what I wanted to do, which was to have an interdisciplinary perspective on the human mind and do some philosophical research. Then in the middle of my PhD, I actually switched to cognitive science and experimental cognitive science. Then I did a postdoc on that, and then a postdoc in psycholinguistics. And then only in my third postdoc, I started doing cognitive neuroscience for 2-3 years. And then at the end, I was lucky enough to get the first ERC starting grant and open my lab. And now what we do is mostly cognitive neuroscience. But I have changed a little bit of different fields before getting here.
Okay, so the anthropology and also epistemology of complexity. I'm not even sure what that means, but did you actually do that, or was it more that was just the title of the program and you ended up doing something?
No, I did like my PhD thesis was like 1/3 philosophical, 1/3 anthropological, and 1/3 experimental. During my PhD, I also went to the Amazon forest, for instance, to study a population there. And
sounds pretty cool.
I read a lot of philosophy. And the epistemology of complexity relates mostly to the work of the philosopher Edgar Morin in France. The people that founded those PhD programs were both pupils of Edgar Morin. And epistemology is always the type of philosophy that I liked the most, right? It's about knowing about knowledge, right? How do we know about stuff? How do we recognize knowledge? And it's easy to translate that into psychological or experimental question, but not super easy, but sometimes it is.
Is going to the Amazon rainforest as cool as it sounds, or is it? I also had early on some book discussions, and we discussed the Humboldt biography, and his, exploration of the Amazon just sounded miserable the entire time. It just sounded horrible, just being like eaten by mosquitoes all day, every day.
Let's say it wasn't so horrible for me. It was much better.
Okay. But you're not doing anything like that anymore, right? No, that was enough. So as I mentioned, I guess the main paper we'll be discussing is grid cells in visually impaired people. I think in your case, actually, also blind people. I think, in my bachelor's, actually, I did a study on blind people or visually impaired people. And then I learned that a lot of technically blind people are not blind, but they can see different kinds of things. So I will get into a little bit of detail of that later, but maybe do you want to just kind of introduce kind of broadly, like why study, like basically how did this project come about? Why visual impairment?
I think it's important to give a little bit of context about the genesis of this paper and of the bigger project of which this paper is part of. So I think that the majority of the audience knows what is a cognitive map. But if we want to give a very quick and broad definition of it, I would say that it is a low-dimensional representation of relational knowledge. That is the broadest definition that comes to my mind. And we know that at the beginning, when we refer to cognitive map, we refer mostly to spatial relationships from the very foundational work of Tolman, which was behavioral work with IS. Basically, the idea was to have a coordinate system, an allocentric representation of the surrounding environments that allowed you to find what you are looking for and to remember where things are and be able to go back home if you need.
And take shortcuts in particular.
And take shortcuts, exactly. And then after a while, people discovered the neural basis of that, or what is hypothesized to be the neural basis, and a central role has the hippocampal entorhinal system, or the hippocampal formation, with the discovery of spatially tuned cells, a lot of them actually. So for instance, place cells in the hippocampus proper, that fire for a specific location, grid cells in the entorhinal cortex, that fire for multiple locations, but with a beautiful regular hexagonal tiling. And then a lot of other, in the entorhinal cortex, you find border cells, you find velocity cells, you find object vector cells, head direction cells, right? And these were believed to be, and are believed to be, the building blocks of cognitive maps, and basically of a coordinate system that allow us to orient ourselves in space. And in fact, at the beginning, scientists thought that they have discovered the GPS of the brain, right? But then something interesting happens, and actually shortly after, people realized that these cells were doing much more than spatial navigation. And they actually were representing relationships and relational knowledge in different domains of knowledge, even abstract domains, and certainly non-spatial domains. Like the first example probably was time. Right? It's easy to go from space to time. And in the hippocampus, you can find place cells that are also time cells. This is the work of Eichenbaum. So these are cells that fire for a specific moment in time, as they fire for a specific position in space. But then I think that, at least from my view, from my knowledge of the literature, the big change and revolution happened around 2016, 2017, when we had the Constantinescu paper from Tim Beren's lab in Science, where they show in humans the grid-like coding underlies also conceptual navigation in a two-dimensional conceptual space. And then shortly after, there was this important paper by Dmitry Aronov in Nature, showing that place cells fire for specific sound frequency in a sound space, and grid cells had multiple firing fields. So they fired for different sound frequency, mirroring exactly what they do during spatial navigation, right? And that from that point, I think it became clear that these neurocognitive machinery that we find in the hippocampal entorhinal system, they represent relational knowledge across different domains. Now, getting to our main question, one question is, how did we get there? Right? And one hypothesis that has been proposed is that evolutionary, like the neurocognitive processes that we evolved to represent space and to navigate the physical environment, have been, through evolution, recycled to navigate memory, to plan things, to organize conceptual knowledge. And this is an idea that we could call like neurorecycling. Some people would call that neurorecycling or neural adaptation or phylogenetic exaptation, right? There are different ways to talk about that. But the idea is that something, in this case, like a cognitive function or a cognitive brain structure that have evolved for a specific function, has been recycled through evolution, because evolution doesn't throw anything away, right? And if there is something that can reuse in a smart way for a new function, we would do that. And so it's being reused for other function. And in this case, for more abstract representation or high level. And from this point of view, space has a primary role, as a sort of primacy. Right? Before, these things evolved to navigate space, and then they are used for something else. But that is not the only hypothesis. Right? Another hypothesis could be that actually these neurons, they were not spatial to start with. And they are memory cells, so to speak. Right? That they evolved to represent knowledge, relational knowledge, and they are good both to represent spatial relationship and non-spatial relationship. It just happened that we discovered them in a spatial task first, but there is no primacy of space. Now, these are two different stories that are kind of just so stories, if you want, but because it's hard to test that, right? It's hard to do experiment through the evolutionary time. But, and then we get to this paper, it is possible that something similar happens during ontogeny. So during the development of the individual. So it is possible that infants, we are talking about humans, but it could be translated also to other species, they start using these neurons to create cognitive maps of the physical environment, to understand and think about spatial relationship. And then during development, when they start thinking about more abstract aspects of experience or encoding relationship in different dimensions, spatial relationship are very basic, right? It's one of the first things that probably we learn as babies. And then slowly these spatial cognition, spatial cognitive structure, neurocognitive structure are recycled to represent navigation in memory more generally, or to structure knowledge more generally. And we call that the scaffolding hypothesis, or the spatial scaffolding hypothesis, because space, to some extent, scaffold abstract knowledge. If that is the case, and then maybe you see where I'm going, then it is possible that people that learn to navigate space in a different way would also navigate concepts in a different way. And that's what brought us to the idea of studying blind people. And there is also an alternative hypothesis to that, which is very similar to the evolutionary one, but just in ontogenetic terms. And that is that actually there is no scaffolding, right? These neurons, they are memory neurons, and they are good to represent relation in space and in non-spatial knowledge. But there is no interdependence between the two. And certainly space doesn't have a primary rule, doesn't have a primacy with respect to other dimensions or more abstract dimensions of knowledge.
Could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on why would testing blind people help tease apart those two options?
Right. The idea is that blind people, because they cannot see, they would develop strategy of navigation of the environment and spatial representation that are different compared to the one of sighted people. And they may find easier to do certain stuff or to represent spatial relational knowledge in a way, and a little bit more difficult maybe to represent spatial relational knowledge in another way. Like, to be more precise, blind people, we know mostly from behavioral studies, behavioral experiments, that they are impaired compared to sighted people in allocentric representation of space and spatial relationship. Whereas the egocentric representation, most of the time in most of the experiments, it's fine. And that could be due because indeed they have an experience of space that is different compared to ours. With vision, you can grasp spatial relationship at a glance to some extent, especially in a big environment where you think about a bigger environment or things that are far away from you. It's a kind of, you can grasp relationship synchronically.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're standing on the 7th floor looking over a city or something, exactly. You can see the entire, or the road, I mean, depending on where you are, the different buildings, all that kind of stuff, which I guess as a blind person, it's more of an experiential thing than just seeing it in one glance.
Yeah, and it's much more diachronic, the experience, right? And sequential.
Diachronic means what?
Or sequential, okay. Right? You learn, you move around the space, and then you learn the location of the different objects in a much more sequential way. And then at the end, of course, you can integrate all this knowledge into a more general and abstract, if you want, allocentric representation. But it's more difficult for them. And you can get that from anecdotes of what they tell you about their own experience, usually is like this, and also from experiments that shows that they are more impaired in allocentric representation compared to egocentric representation. And so these to us seemed like a good starting point, because hippocampal and entorhinal cognitive maps are believed to represent allocentric representation of space with respect to a more egocentric representation that are mostly associated with the parietal cortex. So yeah, our idea was that if we find some differences in the way cognitive maps are represented in the medial temporal lobe in blind people, if we find some differences if we find that grid coding in them is altered during spatial navigation, then we can test whether this translates or generalizes to conceptual navigation, where in principle there is no, how could you say, barriers or difficulties for them, right, to think about sound space or a social space that we know is represented from using grid-like coding.
And I guess interestingly there, you don't, for example, when it's like a social relationship, who's the father of whatever, right? Mm-hmm. It's that kind of thing. I guess there you also don't have, with spatial stuff, as we mentioned earlier, you can have this difference between sighted people and non-sighted people. But I guess for these kind of abstract relationships, sighted people don't have that either because it's abstract, right? So
Exactly. So if we find the same differences, both in spatial and conceptual navigation in sighted and blind, then I think it would be like important evidence in support to this scaffolding hypothesis. And that can help us disentangling the genesis and the development of cognitive maps in humans, and also try to understand better the relationship between spatial and conceptual navigation.
Okay, so let's maybe start, let's start with the patients, or not patients, but the blind people, visually impaired people. So when did they go blind, or when did they have their visual impairment, and how much could they see? What was exactly their kind of...
Yeah, we selected the participants so that the criteria was that they have to have become completely blind before the age of 3, and therefore they should have no visual memory. So some of them, they are congenitally blind. Some of them are born without eyes, for instance, or with very small eyes, like microphthalmia. Other, they have become blind after a few hours or a few days after birth because of too high concentration of oxygen in the incubator, and then burns the retina. This is a retinopathy of prematurity.
But so it meant they were completely blind. Some of the people I talked to, they could see sometimes shapes, or they could things move from left to right, or...
No, they don't have pattern vision. Some of them have light sensitivity. Mm-hmm. Right? So they can tell you whether the light is on or off, for instance. It's just a small percentage. But they cannot use vision functionally to navigate. That is the most important thing for this experiment.
Okay, and so then the task, which is a task I haven't seen before. What did they do?
Right. So in order to get to the objective, we needed to demonstrate first that there is a difference between sighted and blind people during spatial navigation before going into the conceptual navigation part. And especially in grid-like coding. And one thing that I would like to mention is that we didn't have any animal model, because there is no study, there is no study that tests congenitally blind rodents, for instance, or any other mammals, what matters, and measure grid cells. There are studies with congenitally blind rats and place cells or head direction cells. And in both cases, they develop rather normally in rats, although the fighting field is less precise compared to seeing animals.
But I guess rats also don't use vision as much as humans do, right? Don't they use their whiskers quite a lot and smell, that kind of stuff, more than...
Exactly. Yeah, indeed, even if we had an animal model, it is not granted that what works for rats then is the same in humans, because they can use olfactory cues to create an allocentric map of the environment, whereas humans cannot do that, most of the cases, at least. Maybe some people can. So we started with the spatial navigation, and then we had another problem, because the large majority of spatial navigation experiments in fMRI, we wanted to use fMRI to study grid-like coding, they use virtual reality. But with blind people, of course, visual virtual reality is out of the table. Creating an auditory virtual space is very difficult, and also we didn't go for that because the scanner is noisy, right? The fMRI scanner is noisy, so it might have been difficult. And therefore, we got inspired by a couple of papers in 2016, like one from Aidan Horner, the other from Jakob Bellmund, that detected grid-like coding during imagined navigation. So when basically participants, they in some cases they had to close their eyes, like in the Horner paper, and then imagine to navigate a very simple environment. So we set up to do that, and then we had to decide which environment to navigate. And we end up with this idea of navigating a clock environment. We did that for two reasons, but basically because the clock gives you like a perfect configuration if you go from one number to the other number in a straight line, in which you create different trajectories that sample the space with very good periodicity. And that was ideal for the type of analysis that we wanted to do. It's a directional coding analysis. And second is an environment that is very familiar both to blind people and sighted people. Because blind people, they know they know the shape of the clock and how the numbers are distributed. They have tactile clock, the haptic clock in Braille that they can, some of them use in order to tell the time. And also, the majority of blind people, certainly all the blind people that come to do our experiments, they go around with the white cane. Right? And when you do the training to use the white cane and to orient yourself, also like in a city or in the street, they use most of the time like a military direction. They say 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and so on. So
that's really interesting.
Was something that was familiar.
It's really interesting because when I read the task, I thought, like, why would blind people know what a clock face looks like? Like it just made no sense to me because it's, like why? But okay, so there actually is. That's really interesting. I would never have guessed that they would know what a clock face looks like because,
Yeah, no, instead they do, and it's highly familiar to both populations. So the task, we did a little training before entering the fMRI, but not even too much because a clock is a familiar environment. And we told them, well, imagine to be in a big clock and to move from one number to the other. And so they hear the starting number and then the ending number, so from 2 to 8, for instance, and they have to imagine to walk from one number to the other. And then in order to make sure that they were doing the task correctly, then we gave them a third number, like 4, for instance, and they have to say whether, according to the trajectory that they were doing, the third number was on the left or on the right. So we make sure that they have to solve the task spatially, basically, in order to answer this question. And then we have two main questions for this experimental question in this case. And one was, of course, to look at grid coding and see whether it was altered in some way in them. But then also we have a more general question, which was to look at the human navigation network in general, like beyond the medial temporal lobe, beyond the hippocampal entorhinus system, and see whether, to what extent it is resilient to visual deprivation. Because that also was a question that was still out there. And you could expect some differences because, of course, sighted people usually navigate their environment based on vision, which is something that, of course, blind people don't do. And so we have one part of the experiments in which we contrasted this spatial navigation, clock navigation task with a mathematics task in which participants, they hear the same numbers, like number 1, 2, and 3, but they have to do mathematical operation on that. So the stimuli were exactly the same in both conditions, but the process was different. In one case, spatial navigation, in the other case, mathematics. And that was the first type of analysis that we did. We looked at the contrast between navigation versus mathematics, and we found the human navigation network in sighted people, so with parahippocampal region, frontal region, parietal region, occipital region, so the occipital place area was active in doing that. Although also sighted people, they were blindfolded, there was nothing to see there, that was active. And the map of the congenitally blind people looked exactly the same. There was really no difference, like showing that these human navigation system, which basically process spatial information during navigation across different reference frames, allocentric and allocentric, this network is highly resilient to visual deprivation. The only difference that we found was that blind people activated more the right inferior parietal lobe during navigation compared to sighted people. And that makes sense under the point of view that they might use, in general, more egocentric strategy, or they leverage more egocentric representation during the task compared to sighted people. So that was the first result. And then we went on and looked into the entorhinal cortex. And that's where we find some surprise. So not in the sighted people, in sighted people, we replicate this finding that now has been replicated several times, in which we found a six-fold modulation of the fMRI signal in the entorhinal cortex, according to the hexagonal representation of grid cells. And then we tried other control periodicity like 8-fold, 4-fold, 7-fold, 5-fold, and nothing works. So it was very specific, the hexagon. In the blind, instead, we couldn't find this 6-fold activity. And what we find instead was 4-fold modulation. So, which was indicative of a grid that was squared, like a 90-degree periodicity instead of a 60-degree periodicity. So to some extent, we matched what was one of our prediction, and therefore that's the six-fold symmetry would be highly reduced or maybe even absent in blind people. And in that, similar results have been found with older population, like older adults, like Matthias Stangl has a paper showing that grid coding is reduced. And also in older adults, usually what's impaired most is the allocentric representation and not the egocentric representation, or with ApoE4. So that was a match. But we found this fourfold symmetry that we did not predict. And then we say, okay, let's look a little bit into that. Let's characterize this finding as much as we can with the data that we have. And so the first interesting thing is that this is not the first time that a fourfold symmetry emerged in humans. And it has been found, for instance, when humans engage in the virtual navigation in virtual reality of a hairpin maze, right? Which is
what maze, sorry?
Hairpin.
Hairpin. What is what's that? Yeah, in this context.
Yeah, it is a maze in which you enter and then you go up and then you turn and then you go down and then you turn again and then up again and then down and then up again. So basically the type of a movement that you can do in this maze is just 90 degree, right? You go either up, down, left, or right. And that was used, to my knowledge, for the first time in a famous paper with rodents in the Moser lab. The first author is Dorider Dickman. And they found that the spatial periodicity of grid cells breaks down in this condition. And when Tuckery Brown did that in fMRI with humans, they found that compared to the navigation of an open field, in the hairpin maze, the six-fold symmetry went down. So there was no six-fold symmetry, but there was a significant fold symmetry. And the interesting thing that they found is that the average grid orientation of the grid system of the participants in the hairpin maze was aligned with the two main axes of the environment, north, south, and east, west. And so we say, okay, let's see whether that's true also in our case, even though we didn't have any barrier, we didn't have any maze, but it was like, if you want, a sort of open field navigation.
To just clarify if I understand correctly, in the previous task, they basically restricted to some extent the movements they could make, and then they find if you restrict it in this one particular way, then everything adapts to the environment. But here, you didn't do that.
No, we didn't do that, and they could move more or less freely, imagine to move more or less freely in this environment. But nevertheless, we found the same thing. So that the average grid orientation, the main grid orientation of sighted participants, it was spread across all the 360 rotational space. So some participants have these main orientations, and other participants like another less 30 degrees, another 15 degrees, and so on. The blind, no. Basically, all the blind people, they have the same grid orientation as they were anchoring their map to a particular landmarks. And in this case, to the axis of the environment, the main axis of the environment, which indeed they are very salient, right? Because the 6-12 axis
the
of
quarter
the clock,
hours, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that was something that characterized this finding better. And then the other thing that we did was to say, okay, maybe that could be related to the fact that blind people are using a more egocentric representation, or leveraging more on their egocentric representation during navigation. And since we have found that in the previous experiments, like independent analysis, that blind people activated more this inferior parietal lobe, the right inferior parietal lobe, then we correlated that activity with the strength of the fourfold symmetry. And what we found is that blind people, congenitally blind people that activated more parietal cortex during navigation, they also have a higher fourfold symmetry. And interestingly, they also have a higher accuracy during the task. And also, we take the same blind people after or before the experiments, I don't know, into a tennis court, and we did a path integration experiment in the tennis field with them. They were blindfolded and so on. And the activity of the parietal cortex in the scanner predicted the accuracy in this real-world path integration spatial navigation task. So suggesting that there is of course, this is all correlation. It's not causation and investigation, but suggesting that the parietal cortex have a role in the accuracy of spatial navigation, especially in blind people.
Yeah. So as a tennis fan, I know the Italian resurgence in tennis recently, very big in tennis. So I'm not surprised that even neuroscience labs have tennis courts now.
We preceded that, right? Because Sinner was not so good when we did the experiment. So we
you only had, what's his name? Blanking. Italy had one good guy like 10 years ago. I kept forgetting his name. Anyway. But not as good as Sinner. Anyway, I wanted to ask about the fourfold symmetry. I mean, the main finding, I guess, in that sense. And I was just curious, is it any coincidence that a square, like a hexagon, is, I believe, one of three, I don't know what the right term is, but shapes that tiles the environment perfectly, right? It's like triangle, square, and hexagon can tile an environment perfectly, but the pentagon can't. Or can it? I don't think you can. I think you have like holes in there somewhere. I was just curious, is that, it seems to me like it's not a coincidence that even if you don't find hexagonal patterns, you find a different kind of grid that actually perfectly can tile the environment.
Yeah, I don't know about what's the difference in terms of mathematics of packaging, if you want, between a square or an hexagon, but certainly is a regular shape. And I think that several different computational models of grid cells, they probably would work the same or similarly with hexagonal tiling or a square tiling. But unfortunately, the short answer is that I don't know exactly what triggered this fourfold representation. In the paper, we made some speculation based on this characterization of our results, the fact that there is anchoring of the grid orientation to the main axis of the environment, and this correlated activity with parietal cortex. And we said that maybe, and also we have a questionnaire in which we test whether blind people use more egocentric coordinate, egocentric frame of reference during the navigation compared to sighted people, and that is the case. And so we thought that maybe this propensity, there are two ways, I think. Like, one is that the propensity to navigate space egocentrically and to adopt like a more route-like navigation, more than a survey-like navigation of the environment, make them usually thinking about spatial navigation in terms of sequentially and successive turns. And many of them told me that they largely prefer 90-degree turns. But that's, of course, it makes sense, right? Because they are the easier to memorize. You can put a label on that, easier, like left, right, front, behind. And they are easier, 90 degrees, than 60-degree turns or 75-degree turns. So if that's the habitual way in which they think about the environment, it is possible that in the long term, that's shaped the firing field of grid cells, and therefore the basic representation of cognitive maps, to a 90-degree compared to a 60-degree. And that emerges also in our experiment. The other possible explanation instead is that these emerge because of the particular environment that we ask them to navigate, that have these main, very highly salient axes, and because of their egocentric perspective that's made them rely more on these egocentric axes compared to sighted participants. And maybe in a different environment, we wouldn't find something like that. But yeah, we need to do other experiments to figure out that.
Yeah, I guess. So just briefly, I just checked that what I said was correct. And I mean, of the regular shapes, triangles, squares, and hexagons are the only ones that can tile it infinitely. You can combine different shapes, and you can have irregular ones that can do it. But yeah.
Oh, okay.
And the tennis player was Fabio Fognini.
Fognini, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess it's also like what you talked about, the directions. I mean, I guess it doesn't feel like a coincidence in the sense that we don't have. We have the word diagonal, but we can't. You have to specify which diagonal you mean. Whereas, right, as you said, front, back, left, right is very specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another question I had was, so this is something that I've, as someone who's not from the field, have not paid too much attention to. But so this is what I mean is like the specifics within a brain region of the signal that people find. And I think I read in your paper that in the sighted people, you only found the hexadirectional coding in the right entorhinal cortex, but not in the left. I was on the right. Okay, sorry. Okay. But I basically want to ask, is that usually found? Because that's the kind of detail I usually don't pay attention to, whether it's left or right. I'm happy to remember it's the entorhinal cortex. I was just curious, is that something that's typically found or?
It depends. We looked first into the bilateral entorhinal cortex because we didn't have any specific prediction for the hemisphere. And then we looked for specific hemisphere correcting for multiple comparisons statistically. We did not necessarily predicted that in the left, but the other two papers that investigated imagined navigation in humans, they both find 6-4 symmetry in the left hemisphere and not in the right hemisphere. So I don't know why, but at least it's consistent with the literature in imagined navigation. But then in other papers, people find it right lateralized. In other paper, like bilateral, I don't know. I don't know about that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So going back to the kind of broad introduction we had, what does that tell you about the scaffolding?
Right. So now we are finishing to collect the data of the conceptual navigation experiment with both sighted and blind. In this experiment, we asked them to navigate a sound space in which the 2-dimension that they are navigating is duration and frequency of sounds. We did a pilot with sighted people, and we found hexadirectional coding in this sighted control. And then after that, we run a new batch of sighted people and the blind people. We increased the number of blind people that we are testing. We hope we will get to 30 people compared to the 19 of the previous experiment. And then we'll see. There are different possibilities. So either we will find 6-4 symmetry in both sighted and blind in conceptual navigation, right? That will be indistinguishable. And then we'll speak against the scaffolding hypothesis, because actually it shows, as we were discussing before, that when it comes to conceptual navigation, there are no barriers. There is no problem for the fact that you cannot see because you are just conceptually thinking about a non-spatial dimension that both sighted and blind people can think about. Then there will be no distortion of your grid representation. Another possibility is that we find a reduced grid-like coding in blind people compared to sighted people, exactly as we find during spatial navigation. And that would speak in favor of the scaffolding hypothesis, at least to some extent. But maybe we would not find the fourfold, and then we would think that maybe it's something that emerges because of the type of environment that we have used in the first experiment. And that probably would be the most surprising and maybe theoretically interesting results, is that we will find fourfold symmetry in blind people also during conceptual navigation. That's it.
Yeah. About the current study, I was a little bit surprised when you said that your abstract task was about using sound, because it seems to me that's also something where blind people, use it differently than maybe other people in a quite direct way. I don't know whether that's true for all blind people, but at least stereotypically, they have to use their hearing more. Yeah, I was just curious why not use something where it's a bit more abstract, where it kind of is, it should be more similar the way that they actually gain the knowledge and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we thought about using like a social space.
Yeah, something like that.
The one used in the Park paper, like Nature Neuroscience 2021, I think. The problem is that it's hard to learn. Right? In that experiment, they trained 100 people, and then they ended up testing only 20 of them because they could make it through the training. And we cannot do that, right? We have to use all the congenitally blind people that we find, and they are really willing to enter in the scanner. So the task should not be too difficult. And also, if you use dimensions that are not spatial, but they are physical to some extent, like perceptual, like duration and pitch in this case, you can really control very well the level that you subminister to the person. That is that pitch, and that other sound is that other pitch, right? And parametrically change it perfectly. Whereas when it goes to a more abstract dimension, then you really have to rely on the learning of the participants that really have clear in mind how they are at the different levels of the dimension, for instance, popularity and kindness, right? Some social dimension that you can use. And that can make the measurement more noisy. And in a situation in which we cannot afford to put 50 people in the scanner, because it's very hard to find congenitally blind people that are willing to come to Trento, where I am, stay here for 3 days a night and do several experiments. And then
it's also not like a super highly populated area, right? It's not like you're in the middle of London or something and you have 10 million people around you. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So that is the reason.
Okay. I mean, I guess we've already, especially in your kind of introduction to the paper, talked a lot about allocentric and egocentric perspectives. Yeah, I mean, maybe do you want to again just kind of introduce the TiCS paper about cognitive maps and image spaces and kind of what the overall gist of that paper was?
Yeah, that is a paper that I wrote. It's connected with the grant that I got, the ERC grant that I got in 2018. And it's basically a sort of manifesto of that grant. And since I have written the grant, and before starting all the experiments, I say, okay, let's write an opinion paper that summarizes it and then make some prediction, and let's see whether they will burn out. Then they will be met by the experiments. And so I contacted Christian Döller, that I knew him from before. We met at some conferences. He's a great scientist, very nice guy, and of course, like a great expert of cognitive maps and the hippocampal entorhinal system. And I was not. Right? I was coming from a very different perspective, which is the one of metaphor theory, embodied cognition, cognitive linguistics. But in reading and in getting introduced to the literature on hippocampal cognitive maps, I would say, well, but there is another line of research, another parallel literature that is 30 years that is thinking about more or less the same thing. So how do we use space to think about non-spatial concept and especially abstract concept? But we now, without thinking about hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, the brain, the neural locus for us was the parietal cortex. And indeed, the spatial schemas that we were investigating and thinking about were egocentric spatial schemas, not allocentric spatial schemas. So time is a paradigmatic example for that. Right? We think about time and temporal relationship according to a mental timeline. So for us, the past is on the left and the future is on the right, or the future is in front and the past is on the back. And you can test that in very simple experiments in the lab. Right? If you have to classify sentences as related to the future or related to the past, you are faster when the key for the past is on the left and the key for the future is on the right, compared to the opposite response code. But also, if you outside of the lab, if you look at people when they are talking, most of the time they make gestures, like co-speech gestures. We Italians are famous for doing that, but actually everyone does that. Right?
We just don't do it as well. We're very primitive gestures, yeah.
And when you look at that and people are talking about temporal relationship, they gesture on the left when they say, well, before I did that, and then afterwards I'm going to do that, and then they gesture on the right. And most of the time they are not aware that they are doing this, but their hands, they reflect basically the mental schema that they are doing. Right? And these mental schema are also experience dependent. So they can be changed by experience. That's also connect with the idea that space is a kind of a scaffold for more abstract knowledge, in the sense that if you have a different spatial experience in a relevant way, then you will also have a different mental timeline, for instance. So for people that read from right to left, so they have a different type of orthography, then the past is on the right and the future is on the left. And there are several other examples like this. For instance, valence, which is a very abstract construct to some extent. So what you like, what you don't like, what is good and what is bad. It's also specialized in our mind. Like right is good, left is bad. And there are these experiments that shows this bias. So for instance, if you have two CV in front of you, like on your desk, and they are basically equal, and you have to choose which one you want to give the job to, you have a slightly more chances to choose the one on the right. And the same for some abstract art, right? That is equivalent in many ways. We have this bias to prefer the one that are on the right. And this has been tested again several times and replicated several times, this rightward bias for balance, unless you are a lefty. If you are a left-handed, then you have the opposite bias. And the strongest your leftness is, then the more you tend to prefer things that are on the left side. So again, it's using space or to organize this abstract knowledge to some extent, but in a way that is highly egocentric. And anything, well, maybe I thought that maybe these two, like hippocampal cognitive map and these egocentric schemas for abstract knowledge, they are just two faces of the same coin. They are just two different manifestations of the propensity of our mind and of our brain to use space to represent and structure knowledge in general. And when I say space, it's also itself a metaphor to say low-dimensional schematic representation of relational knowledge. I think that is the definition that is the best one, which doesn't necessarily take into account the scaffolding hypothesis, doesn't give necessarily a primacy to space itself and to spatial experience itself, because that can be true in some cases and maybe not in other cases. But in general, this low-dimensional representation that's maybe good for structuring knowledge, generalization, reasoning, planning, and maybe ultimately also they are highly related to declarative knowledge, our ability to travel in time, and as we travel in space, like mental time travel, mental space travel, and so on and so forth. So that is, and so I teamed up with Christian just to have his supervision and support, so that I was writing not too much stupid things about cognitive maps and the hippocampus, because at the time it was not my focus. And it was a great collaboration. And after that, we actually did several other studies together, and we keep collaborating very well together.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned, there's this whole other literature that kind of looks at very similar things, because what I always find kind of funny about the spatial navigation stuff is that in a very similar the way the whole memory stuff and spatial navigation stuff also ran in parallel for decades, right?
Exactly.
With, the very famous papers on both sides that kind of, I mean, now is being integrated and has been integrated, but for a long time, it feels to me, didn't really do that. So it's kind of funny that spatial navigation, I mean, it's probably just because it's done in rodents initially, right? So that just makes it quite different. But I don't know, it's kind of interesting that spatial navigation has two entire lines of research that it could have connected with very early on, but somehow didn't.
Actually, this prediction burned out because it was supported by some empirical papers that we just published. And indeed, we found that during conceptual navigation of a conceptual space, you have allocentric representation in terms of grid coding and cognitive maps in the hippocampal formation. But then you have egocentric representation in the parietal cortex, showing that this, as in the navigation of the physical environment, allocentric and egocentric combines to some extent, and they are in order to give you a representation of integrated representation of the environment and the possibility to navigate. That happens also during conceptual navigation. And also we just finished a paper that we are about to submit in which we find also this coexistence of the allocentric and egocentric reference frames during mental time traveling. So that's the ability to project yourself in the future and to project yourself in the past and to think about temporal relationship is mediated by egocentric representation in the parietal cortex and allocentric representation in the medial temporal lobe. So kind of pushing this relationship and this relationship between spatial navigation and conceptual navigation, and showing that the whole system, it's probably recruited and involved in structuring knowledge according to this neural geometry or low dimensional representation, and not only the hippocampal entorhinal system.
So, I mean, one kind of very broad question, but kind of why, in a sense, the question is a little bit like, why do we have these two separate systems? Or, I mean, yeah, but a different way maybe of asking it is also like, how do they interact, or how do you go from one to the other and that kind of stuff? Because, I mean, it seems to me kind of obvious that we perceive initially stuff from an egocentric perspective, and then you kind of build an allocentric perspective from that. Is that kind of roughly how it works, or is that just a simplification?
Yeah, we don't know exactly, but one key to understand the need of these two systems would be that when you think about the structure of a conceptual system, you need to have, let's say, time is a good example. If you think about a series of events, you need to have a representation of how the events are related with each other, independently of the point of view that you assume, like a bird's view on history, for instance, and knowing which event comes after which other events and before which other events and so on. But then when you retrieve these events, you do that from a point of view. It's related to assessing the information, keeping that in working memory, and then manipulating this information so that, for instance, you can approach these time traveling by putting yourself within the sequence, right? And then thinking about what is in front of you or what is behind you, or just looking at the sequence from outside perspective, right? In both cases, however, you have a point of view. And when you start trying to maybe manipulate these events or things like you can engage in counterfactual thinking, for instance, what would happen if that would happen before and this other thing afterwards, then you can use this more short-lived and flexible egocentric representation that are related to assessing this information. So the dichotomy between long-term representation and short-term perspective in order to assess and manipulate, I think it could be a key to see how these two systems are important also beyond spatial navigation. Like a good example for that is the famous experiment that was done here in Italy in the 70s, I think, by Bisianca and Lutazzi of the Piazza Duomo, right, the Duomo Square of Milano, with people with hemispatial neglect, that when you ask them to describe the piazza by looking at the Duomo, they have to imagine that. They describe only one side of the piazza, right? But when then you say, okay, now imagine that you have the Duomo behind your shoulder, they also describe one side of the piazza, but the other side, like showing that they have a general representation, an allocentric, stable representation of the piazza somewhere stored, but they can access only part of it. So that could be a theoretical key to look at this.
I just wanted to ask a little bit. I mean, you kind of mentioned it earlier already, but I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on it and maybe guess a bit. I don't know how much is known about this exactly, but about kind of what exactly people do when they use metaphors. I mean, metaphors and analogies, right? As you said, a spatial analogy, something like that. I mean, is the kind of, I mean, to me, it seems like the obvious interpretation there is this kind of scaffolding hypothesis. Yeah. Where you say, okay, we have this kind of way of dealing with stimuli of multiple dimensions or whatever, but we use this kind of machinery to think about it. Is that kind of what's going on? Or, yeah, maybe in general, kind of in relation to what we've been talking about, what exactly are we doing when we're using metaphors?
Yeah, that's an odd question. And I wanted to do some empirical research on that, like neuroimaging research and relating metaphorical thinking with cognitive maps. But among the old things that we are doing things, that is one of the list, but I find it particularly difficult to set up an experiment that would hit on the precise mechanism of low-dimensional representation during metaphorical thinking without having confounds with high-dimensional semantic processing, basically. Right. But the idea, more generally, is that when you engage in metaphor and analogy, and I know that there is many people that share this idea. If you read, for instance, Tim Barron's early theoretical papers on cognitive maps, it appears clear that this is a mechanism for analogy, right? To generalize certain structure from one domain to another domain. And that's why, like a tree structure, you can find it when you talk about grammar, you can find it when you talk about genealogical relationships, or when you talk about a tree, right? How is
decision making?
The tree.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that is, what is that? It is a independent structural representation that is, using the words of Tim Barron's, like factorized from what it contains. It is, you have the structure, and then you can put in the structure whatever it is. They can be words in a sentences. They can be your uncle, dad, mother, and so on. But once you have the structure, then you can predict, you can make prediction, you can find shortcuts, you can understand that structural domains, potentially in terms of another one, the one that have the same structure. And that is basically what an analogy is, at least from a cognitive science perspective. That is what Deirdre Gettner, which is probably the cognitive scientist that's most famous one that studied analogy, would tell us, is generalizing structural representation from one domain to the other. However, when we do that, especially for linguistic metaphors, then there are a lot of distinctions that you should do. It's hard because there are some metaphors that are crystallized in language, and probably you don't need to do this process no longer. Sometimes doing this transfer knowledge from one domain to the other domain actually is not so easy, and it works much better when there is a superficial semantic similarity between the two domains. But then if the two domains are superficially and semantically similar, then probably you don't need necessarily to do this structural transfer from one to the other. So I think it's a very interesting topic of investigation. But myself, I haven't found yet the way to attack this problem in a way that I like it, and I say, okay, that's the right way to do that without any confounds and to look into this cognitive process. But maybe other people will, right? So.
Yeah, no, I can see why that's difficult. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, just whilst you were talking, I guess because you mentioned metaphors, and we earlier talked about literatures that were kind of parallel. I guess the Peter Gerdenfurst's book about conceptual spaces, in a sense, is another kind of separate kind of line of literature that, I mean, maybe it overlaps with and he also discusses metaphors quite a lot in his book. Yeah, it seems like everyone's basically doing the same thing, just from a slightly different angle and calling it differently. Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned your ESC grant earlier twice, and probably because I queued you up a little bit before we started recording, because I wanted to ask a little bit about it. Because, yeah, I mean, I'm, as a starting postdoc, this is the kind of stuff I'm starting to think about. And yeah, when I saw your CV, it seems like you've done quite well for yourself in terms of getting money from the ERC in particular, with a starting and a conciliatory grant back to back. So yeah, as I said before we started recording, I don't have any particular questions here. I'm just curious. It seems like you know the odd thing about it. So any tips for getting these kind of grants? Or?
Yeah, I can give some tips, but basically it's how I do. It's how I write the grant. I don't know to what extent they can generalize, or they are good tips, maybe just being lucky. But in general, something that I do, and when I talk with other people that maybe are preparing this type of grant, they don't do or they struggle with, is that I like to start from the general question, like a big theoretical question. And I like to phrase it in a way that is as simple as possible, not because the question itself is simple, but to find a way to communicate it in a couple of sentences. And then, of course, it will be is a question that I'm interested in, deeply interested in. And when I find it, and then I find the main hypothesis that I want to test, then I design the experiments. Then I design the 5 years of experiments, for instance, that are necessary for the submission of a ERC grant. Whereas sometimes I talk with people and they tell me, I have a lot of ideas for experiments and so on, but I don't know how to put them together, right, in a coherent proposal. And sometimes what I say to them is, just start over. Do not worry too much about what you have already done and to fit everything you like or everything you are good at in this proposal. But think about what are your interests and what is the theoretical question that you find most important and that arguably is still on the table, and then you think you have a good idea in how to solve it. And then once you have this general framework and you talk with people and people tell you, oh yeah, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a very good idea. Then you know that you are onto something. And then you start designing your experiments.
So, I mean, it sounds like a very kind of top-down approach, right? By just really, I mean, also taking it the way, the order a grant is written, where you start with the big stuff and then you go into specifics and then experiments and that kind of stuff. I mean, is that genuinely also like how you come up with this stuff? Or is it, because I mean, in a way, often it's much more, you have a really cool experiment and sometimes it's difficult to explain why. And I guess, is that what you said, what most people do? Then you have this kind of experiment that's difficult to explain. So it's...
Yeah, but also because it's the type of grant, right? It's a very rich grant. It's long, like it's 5 years. And they want high risk, high gain projects, right? So you cannot propose an incremental work. Like, that's what I did for the last 3 years. I discovered that, and then I want to change these and see what happened, to change that and see what happened, and so on. That's not the type of work that they would be interested in. They want to found something that, if it works, could be groundbreaking. That's usually the term that is used for ERC. And therefore, you will have either a technical advantage, right? If you propose to test like a new technique, for instance, or most of the time, theoretical advantage. So to theoretical advancement, clear theoretical advancement. And that, I think, it's easier to obtain if you think about the question first and if you think about why is that important in terms of basic research. And then you figure out the way to test it. You plan the experiments accordingly. Yeah.
So if I understand it correctly, I think somebody said earlier is also that the study that we discussed with the blind people, that was part of your starting ground, or not?
Yeah.
So had you, as I think you said, you hadn't really done that kind of research before with the, I don't know, had you done fMRI before at all, or just not that kind of special navigation?
Yeah, no, I did fMRI.
Analysis.
I work with blind people, but never worked at all with the hippocampus or spatial navigation or cognitive maps.
So my question then is basically, how can you then sell that you are the right person to do this research and that you can supervise people to do it, right? Because especially ERCs, you have a couple of PhD students, something like that.
Right. Yeah, but that is not a problem too much, because I knew how to do neuroimaging, I knew how to do fMRI, so I knew how to use the tool. And I had a background in, broadly speaking, this idea of using space to represent non-spatial knowledge. What I was showing, the big idea at the time was that the main hypothesis of the grant was this one of the neural recycling and the spatial scaffolding, right? That we somehow reuse or recycle the neurocognitive machinery to navigate space, to navigate our knowledge and concepts. This was still new, right? At the time, it was really the moment in which the first papers kind of supporting this view were coming out, was 2017, when I wrote and submitted the grant. And then I had this sub-question, like, do people that navigate space in a different way, that navigate concepts in a different way? Are we looking just at half of the picture here? Are we missing all the other half, that is the egocentric representation? So let's put together these two literature. This one that I know, and the other one that I don't know to some extent, but of course I have done my readings, right, in order to write the grant. And then another couple of questions like this one was about high dimensional versus low dimensional representation, right? That was another take. So big question, and then some sub question, hypotheses, but that still at the time they were very new to some extent, and original at least.
Okay, yeah. So basically, you had all the existing stuff around it. It's just like the very new stuff you hadn't done, but then again, very few people had done it. So, and you could make the point that you could learn it. Or did you already specify collaborators with that, or in the grant itself? Or
no, I didn't.
Okay.
But again, they assume that if you know how the brain works, basically, if you know how to do fMRI experiments or MEG experiments, the fact that instead of focusing on parietal cortex or on the visual system of blind people, then you go and focus on the entorhinal cortex or the medial temporal lobe. It's something that you can do the switch very, very easily, because it's not learning like a completely new set of skills, basically.
And so that was a starting grant, the consolidated grant that, I guess, has it started, or is it starting now? Something like that?
It's starting in a month. Yeah.
In a month. Okay. So what are you proposing for that, if you can share it?
Yeah, that is something that came out from the experiments of the first grant, and especially this paper that we just published. And we didn't talk about that now, and probably we don't want to go into that, because otherwise it's another podcast. But on the fact that spontaneous eye movement reflects the neural geometry of conceptual space. And then we saw those results, and then we saw some other results that also during navigation of conceptual space in fMRI, we saw some eye movement signature. And then I had these other papers showing that you have a grid-like coding for visual stimuli, in following visual stimuli, but even when you follow them with covert attention and not with the eye movement. But then I started thinking, also on the basis of a previous idea that I had before, that maybe there is something here in the way attention, cognitive maps, and in general conscious assets interact with each other. And then basically the proposal is to look into what I call attentional code for memory, and see whether relational knowledge. So not only the navigation of cognitive maps, but first of all, to test more rigorously whether the navigation of cognitive maps correspond to movement of attention in internal space. You can go, and movement of attention, they can be indexed very well by eye movement, at least in sighted people, because the oculomotor system and the attentional system are highly overlapping in the human brain. And then take this idea and bring it beyond the maps, beyond the cognitive maps, and looking at combinatorial attention, the combination of attentional states, how they can index any type of conceptual relationship. That is the idea, generally speaking.
I mean, so I obviously, I don't know how these grant things work, right? I mean, that's part of what I'm asking. But I'm a little bit surprised that, in a sense, what surprised me about it is that it seems very complex and abstract, a lot of it. And that people, from what I've heard about grants, it's like, people have to understand it pretty quickly. And, probably without spending hours of concentrated reading, but, 15 minutes in the evening when they have to review it. So I'm impressed that you managed to, it seems at least you managed to write that in a way that was easily understandable and seemed doable also.
Right. Yeah, somehow I did.
So that's just a process of just trying again and taking a top-down approach from the beginning and then just rewriting until it's simple enough? Or
because then you have and then you maybe I explained this in a very abstract way, but then at the end, one thing that helped me, I think that I was talking about something that everyone knows, which is attention. Right? So I didn't have to explain to some extent what attention is. Of course, there is the William James said that you know what is attention until someone asks you to explain it, and then you don't know what it is, and so on. But for reading the abstract at 9 o'clock in the evening and so on, you can assume that people have an idea of what attention is. And for instance, what I was proposing, and that was a sentence in the grant and also in my presentation, is that to look at the phenomenon that is very well known, but with different eyes, right? And so we have studied attention so far in terms of its selective property. Right? Attention as a selection. You select these and these and these and these. I wouldn't say that actually we should look at attention in terms of its generative properties, because in doing the selection and subdividing basically the information, chunking the information and so on, you find yourself with states that have some characteristics, and I don't go into the details, but they can be combined. And then you can find yourself with a sort of language, if you want to use a metaphor. So let's go beyond, that's a way in which I would say that, in which I say that let's go beyond the selective properties of attention and look at the generative properties of it. And of course, I had some pilot studies and data that shows that what I was proposing was not too risky and too preposterous, but to some extent it has to be high risk, right? The idea. And,
right. I guess that's specific to whatever grant one is applying for, but those two are like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. For me, I don't know, I started my postdoc like 4 months ago now. So especially with yeah. Well, but you can apply for the starting grants, I think, from your second or third year on after your
from the
PhD.
third.
So it's or there are like similar versions in different countries that do similar things, more or less, or smaller things. Like in Switzerland, where I'm right now, there's the Ambizione, which you can do from your second year onwards. You need 1 year of postdoc experience to apply, which is for one PhD student, I believe, and yourself. So it's a bit smaller, but it's still the kind of thing that, how should I put it? When I last year applied for my first fellowship, even though it'd been on my horizon that these things are coming, I was still, when I had to actually do it, it was way more work than I thought it was going to be. There are lots of things I'd never written about or even thought about. So I guess this is my little attempt to kind of keep these things a little bit in the back of my mind, at least, and then still do it last minute. But yeah. So at the end of each of my interviews, I ask my guests the same 3 questions. And the first is, what's a book or paper you think people should read? It can be very old. It can be very completely new. It can be completely unknown. It can be the most famous paper. I don't really mind. Just any recommendations for you think that people should spend a little bit more time on?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you like a book that was very important for me. It's kind of a hidden gem. It's very hidden in the sense that almost no one knows it. And also it's not very popular in the academic field. It's a bit controversial, but I like it. So, and the book is, let's start with the title.
It's a good start, yeah. Or the author. It's also a good way
so
to start.
the author is Julian Jaynes. And the title is The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of Bicameral Mind.
Yeah, I've heard of that. But yeah, okay.
You've heard of that?
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
So let me say
I'll let you explain it, yeah.
Yeah, let me say something about that. So the premise is that most probably the majority of the book is wrong. And it's a fantastic book. It's the work of a lifetime for Julian Jaynes, which was an adjunct professor, I think, at Princeton. The book was published in 1978, I think 1977. And it is an essay on cognitive archaeology and Homeric psychology to some extent. Okay. And the history of the guy is very interesting because it came from behaviorism and he wanted to understand consciousness. And then at a certain point, it said, oh no, but consciousness. And then he tried to go back biologically in the evolutionary scale to see which is the most simple organism that can have consciousness. And he was doing experiments with plants, for instance, to see what the plants could learn and so on. And at some point I say, no, I think that consciousness is actually something that we achieve culturally. We are not born conscious, but we have to be to some extent educated to be conscious. And also we need a language for doing that. And therefore he started a research that is archaeological, basically. And he came out with this idea that ancient population, they have a different cognitive structure that he called bicameral mind. Now, the book is fascinating. Again, is unfalsifiable, of course, because you cannot go back in time and see what kind of cognitive architecture they had 3,000 years ago, let's say. And I think, at least from my perspective, the main psychoarchaeological hypothesis is wrong. But it's a fantastic reading. And that is the hidden gem. I think there are 100 pages in this 600 pages book that are genuinely psychologically, in which he goes through psychology and neuroscience, trying to explain what is consciousness and what consciousness is not. It gives a clear definition of a rational definition of consciousness, which is coincident with what modern philosophy would call access consciousness with respect to phenomenological consciousness. And then he suggests that the way we come up with a conscious declarative representation is to construct an internal mind space, basically. And in doing that, he anticipated by a decade, at least, a lot of cognitive linguists. He was talking about how space as time is represented in a spatial way, and how space is actually important, structural. It gives structure to a lot of cognitive processes and so on. And I read that book when I was a student, a university student, and I was fascinated by that. At the beginning, I was fascinated by the archaeological part. Right? To say, well, that is crazy. If it's like that for real, that would be crazy. But then slowly, when I started understanding a little bit more, I got more and more caught by these ideas that a few years later I found back in the literature that we discussed so far. So yeah, it's a beautiful book, and I will recommend to read it.
Okay, great. A second question is, what's something you wish you'd learned sooner? This can be from your work life, your private life, just something where you think, it would have been nice if you'd learned that a bit sooner, and maybe how you dealt with it or how you found it out.
That is easy. Coding. Coding and mathematics, trigonometry, linear algebra, this kind of stuff. I had a very classic humanistic.
That's quite common in Italy, right? Or, I mean, the one other time I've talked about his career, Camillo Padua-Schioppa, he also said he had a very humanistic kind of education in school.
Yeah, I mean, you can have also more technical one.
Maybe just coincidence.
Background is in clinical psychology, right? I studied psychoanalysis a lot, and I learned statistics basically during my PhD, right? So it was a long run. I had to fill up a lot of gaps. It was a good run. Like I am happy to have had this experience, which is something that a lot of colleagues don't have. So, and that I think it helped me a lot in the process that I was describing before, or starting from the big question and then going down to more precise. But yeah, a little bit more of a coding and mathematics that would have helped.
Yeah, I guess you could have just said, remember how I said I studied psychology? That's basically the same. They said that would have made the same statement, basically. Yeah, I think everyone who studied psychology was like, yeah, that would have been useful. But the people that I talk to who on this podcast, because they are researchers and not people who want to do clinical stuff necessarily as their main profession. I think those people don't, and I'm quite glad that they didn't have to do that. Last question is, any advice for people, late PhD students, early postdocs, basically people like me? Anything you want to give me on the way?
Right. I think that's the advice is to read a lot, because when you are in these early stages of career, I think it's important to create as much as possible a line of research that is your own. And so to have new ideas, and the ideas, they come, at least for me, they come out of reading broadly, reading also outside of your discipline. Sometimes it helps, but also outside of the topic that you are working on, because then you can get interested in something else, but also you can take, again, right, metaphorically or structurally or analogically, some structure or ideas, methods even, that apply in a different subfield, and then applied it to yours, and then gain some knowledge. So that is my advice, is read as much as possible, and of course try to figure out a general question or general research path that really truly interests you. That, I think, is the most important thing for me. For instance, I read a lot of essays of popular books in neuroscience and so on, not because I'm going to learn particularly like something. In some cases, I know most of it, but also because in this book, if the author is good, and there are many colleagues that are very good in doing that, they bring back the big question, right? They bring back basically the reason why we do that. Because otherwise, our everyday life is try to design the little details of the experiment, select the stimuli, or decide which kind of analysis we would use, or coding up stuff and so on, and focused on very specific topic that is easy to become autoreferential and forget about why you are doing that at the end, which is to understand human nature, which is to make progress in science and generally understand human nature. And then sometimes I read the popular books to remind myself how cool it is what I'm doing and why it is important that I do that.
Yeah, it's definitely easy to get lost in the details.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you think you don't have time for reading, podcasts are available.
Exactly.
Maybe they're not quite as I would hope that a book is more refined than a podcast, where we basically just like this kind of podcast.
As you were saying in the introduction, is a different way to get information. Podcasts are useful in a way that they highlight parts that maybe are not highlighted in a book or in a paper. That's
exactly. This is very you're right. But I guess what I'm trying to do with my podcast, even though I never thought about it that way, is to have a thing that's complementary to a popular science book, to a paper, to a presentation, that kind of stuff. I think those are all my questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.